Okay, now you all have a note that we're going live, right?
Yep.
Okay. Hi, neighbor. Welcome to Can We Talk, where neighbors talk about neighborhood issues. Tonight, the program is about social housing in Washington, D.C., and the timeliness of it is because a bill has been introduced into the D.C. Council. This program is brought to you by the listserv, the neighborhood listserv Hear Us Now, which encourages neighborhood discussion, and by DuPont East Civic Action Association, which is dedicated to community engagement and civic action, and by the citywide Coalition on DDOT Bike Plans, which now has a dozen neighborhoods in the coalition. So as I said, our principal guest tonight is Will Merrifield, who's a specialist in social housing. I'm going to let him speak a little bit about himself, and then we'll get started with the presentation on social housing. As I say, the timeliness of it is because a bill has been introduced into the DC Council, the Green New Deal, which incorporates social housing, and we're going to learn about that tonight. Some of the events that are coming up that are really exciting, and see if we can participate in some of those. So Will, I'm going to give you the mic.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and appreciate you for inviting me, Nick. Like Nick said, I'm Will Merrifield. I was a housing attorney for about a decade in Washington, D.C. I represented tenant associations across the district. They were going through large-scale redevelopment projects, and I represented those tenants with the intention of keeping their housing affordable through those redevelopments. In 2020, I ran for office as an at-large candidate, and I ran on a platform that the main component of it was this concept of social housing as a way to solve the affordability crisis in Washington, D.C. So tonight, I just wanted to speak a little bit about what social housing is. Nick had sent me a couple questions that he thought may be helpful to distinguish social housing. And then I know that Robin and the Wardman team want to talk about social housing at the Wardman and the potential of using the Wardman for social housing. So yeah, to jump in, what social housing is, it's a very efficient way to build deeply affordable mixed income housing that pays for itself. In a social housing model, the government views housing as a public good, and it builds housing as infrastructure. And that housing is it's built to rationally and efficiently meet the needs of the citizens of the municipality. Social housing, because it's municipally owned, it cuts out the private developers. So there's no profit motive. Therefore, in a social housing model, 100% of rents are used productively and invested back into the building to cover the operating cost of the building. At the end of the month, once the rents are used to cover operating costs, there's a surplus. And that surplus goes to pay down the construction loans of the building. So, like I said, it's a very simple model. It's similar to a co-op, the way a privately owned co-op works, except in a social housing model and the one that's envisioned in the legislation that we'll talk about in a second. It's municipally owned, which means because it's municipally owned, it can be built on a larger scale. And, in Washington, D.C., we need it built on a larger scale in order to solve this affordable housing crisis. The legislation that has been proposed on social housing was proposed by Janice Lewis George, and it's the Green New Deal for housing in Washington, D.C. And it legislates there to be an office of social housing within DHCD tasked with building and implementing social housing in the District of Columbia. That is a very exciting, it's a very exciting development. The model of the housing in the bill is based off a model of social housing in Vienna, Austria. For people who are not familiar, in Vienna, Austria, they have about 1.9 million people that live in Vienna, and there are about 220,000 municipally owned housing units in Vienna. And along with those 220,000 municipally owned units, there's another 200,000 cooperative units in Vienna, Austria. So Vienna, it's, you know, a world-class city. I think it's been ranked the best city in the world to live in by various publications for about 7 years running. And a big part of that is because the government has invested in deeply affordable housing there through this social housing project. And because they've invested in creating this large stock of social housing, they're able to essentially give the public a public option. It's really, really high quality housing, and it allows people to basically have a public option in their housing, which drives down rents across the board because the private market has to compete with this very well built, very nice municipally owned housing. The other thing about the Vienna model that distinguishes it from public housing in the United States or a lot of other public housing in Western European nations, it's open to the broad middle class of Vienna. So like I said, Vienna has 1.9 million people. About 75 to 80% of Vienna's population qualifies to live in social housing. And that is really the beauty of the model, is that it's open to the broad middle class of citizens. One, it allows it to be a very, very popular program, but two, because a broad section of the middle class is able to access social housing, they are able to pay rents that can cover the operating cost of the social housing units. So in the United States, the thing about public housing that's led to its downfall, and I don't know if people have seen the HUD report on DCHA recently, it's pathetic the way that organization has been run. But the downfall of public housing, not just in Washington, D.C., but in a lot of parts of, and every other part of the United States, is that it concentrated very low income people in public housing units, which means that their rents could never cover the operating costs of the building. So those buildings, in order to be maintained, in order not to be run down, they had to depend on the federal government to subsidize public housing. And the federal government stopped investing in public housing. They went to a Hope 6 model. Then Hope 6 was renamed Choice Neighborhoods. New Communities in Washington, D.C. is a local version of those federal models. And what those federal models are meant to do is to privatize the social housing. So it was allowed to be run down, crumbling around its residents, and now there's this push to privatize. So, like I said, I don't want to repeat myself. Social housing, the Vienna model, which is what Janice Lewis George's proposed legislation is based off of, it does the opposite of what public housing does. It opens housing up to everyone. It's non-means tested. And the concept is open it up to people, allow a mix of renters in, therefore the rents can always cover the operating costs. Let me just close with one other point, and then if people want to ask clarifying questions, I'm happy to answer. But the last point that I'll make is that, like I said, in Vienna, there's 1.9 million people that live in Vienna. One of the, capital cities of Western Europe. There is, I believe there's a UN office in Vienna. It's a global city. On average, people pay 27% of their income in rent in Vienna. So even though, they have this amazing city with all these amenities that everybody wants to go to, the average rent paid by the citizens is 27% of people's income, which obviously is much lower than Washington, D.C. And that's because the government has invested in the social housing model.
Let me interrupt you there just for a moment. 27%, but only with the social housing, correct?
No, across the board.
Across the board.
Yeah, so that's the beauty of the model.
Let's all go to Vienna.
Rents across the board because the private sector then has to compete with those rents. And I know I said I'd shut up, but let me just highlight one other point before questions. I wanted to sort of compare this with the way Washington, D.C. Does their housing policy by talking about a specific project and sort of explaining, how the two things are different. So the wharf in Washington, D.C. on the Southwest waterfront, everybody knows about the wharf. The wharf was public land before it was built there. It was given to the development team. It was $95 million worth of land given to the development team for $1. And that $95 million is probably less than it was actually worth, but that's what it was appraised at, $95 million. So when that developer was able to get that $95 million piece of land, the development team was then able to leverage that public subsidy into an $874 or $847 million loan from Goldman Sachs. So almost $1 billion loan from Goldman Sachs. And once that money from Goldman Sachs, once people knew about that, the land values in Navy Yard and Southwest DC went through the roof. And when those land values went through the roof, then only developers that had access to the type of institutional investors, hedge funds, sovereign wealth funds, those types of big conglomerates, only developers that had access to that sort of investment class were able to build anything in Southwest DC Navy Yard. And what does that investment class want built in a place like Washington, DC? They want the biggest bang for their buck, so they only invest in luxury projects for the most part. So that is why a lot of the things that were built in Southwest DC after, the wharf were very high-end projects that drove up housing costs that has made, the wharf and Navy Yard one of the more expensive neighborhoods to rent in Washington, D.C. Government helped lay the groundwork for this with building roads, bridges, sports stadiums. Now, I'm not saying that to say that development isn't a good thing. I believe development's a very good thing. And underinvested communities like the Southwest waterfront, before all that investment came in, it needed investment. But what is the type of investment that we're encouraging in Washington, D.C.? In Washington, D.C., we're encouraging the type of investment that we saw in Navy Yard and the Southwest waterfront, an influx, avalanche of capital into the neighborhood, the clearing out of a lot of affordable units that were in that neighborhood, and the building up of luxury apartments that most working class people in Washington, D.C. can't afford. And you see that model all over Washington, D.C. You can go up Rhode Island Avenue in Northeast D.C. and see that model. We've seen that model in U Street. So what a social housing model does is it builds new housing. It invests capital into these underserved neighborhoods, but it does it with the intention of building nice, new, broadly affordable housing that not only helps to keep people in those neighborhoods, still in those neighborhoods, and invest in those people in those neighborhoods, but it also brings new people into those neighborhoods to take advantage of the new housing that's built. So I think that that is a much more rational and efficient development model than the development model that we see being exercised in Washington, D.C. today, because the D.C. model is created a really unsustainable housing situation and a housing crisis in Washington, D.C. So that's my spiel, and I'm happy to turn it over to Robin or back to Nick.
Well, if people have questions, raise your hand. There's a tool at the bottom that says, what does it say? Raise your hand. The tool at the bottom, it says raise your hand. So if you have a question, I'm going to start just with a comment that we are looking at U Street and the development of U Street. It hasn't happened yet, but with all the development in the city, it brings in new wealth and it forces out, displaces the current residents. And it not only displaces people, it displaces communities. And that is the lifeblood of the city. That's something we need to respect. U Street corridor is famous for its culture, and that will be scrubbed and erased from the history books if the same pattern proceeds. That's why the whole matter of social housing is something that needs to be considered seriously, because what we have is not working. It's rather destructive. So I see Jerry has a question.
Does everyone in a social housing unit or complex pay the same rent?
So you can do it a couple different ways. Thanks for the question. It's a great question. You can do it a couple different ways. The way that the legislation that's been proposed in DC imagines it is that everybody pays 30% of their income in rent. And because there is a cross section of renters, the people that make more, their 30% pays more, and that the social housing buildings are structured that we want roughly a third and a third and a third. A third market rate renters, a third middle income renters, and a third low income renters. But another important part is to make sure within that mix that we're covering the operating costs of the building. So it's trying to figure out a good formula to cover the operating costs, but the idea and the model is for a third, and a third, and everybody paying the same amount.
So does that mean that there's different quality units?
No.
If your 30% is very low, you get a different unit than if your 30% is very high?
No,
or all the units are the same and it doesn't matter what your income is?
So all the units are the same. It doesn't matter what your income is. The idea is that that the city is building, the municipality, the district is building high quality housing for everyone to enjoy, so that the units would be the same, across the board.
Robin?
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to add a little thought. I have encountered a lot of opposition from the mayor and certain council members who regard social housing, which they've heard about, as a fantasy or goody two shoes or something like this. And public housing, when it started out, was quite idealistic in America. It was unusual. We were going to go ahead and pay for housing for poor people. And I like to think of social housing as public housing 2.0. So we learned about, some problems that we encountered with the concentration of poverty. We hadn't thought of that. And of course, the biggest problem is the failure to pay for maintenance and upkeep on these properties, which then fell into disarray. We did this across the board, actually, in America, with our schools and our libraries too, to some extent. And the incredible beauty of social housing is it takes care of that. So you don't fall into that. You've got the multi-levels of economic levels in one building, and you've got the ability to pay to keep it up. In fact, as it's publicly owned property, the monies can in fact go back into the public coffers for more infrastructure, just as Will said. So we never have to deal with budgets and budget cuts and problems like that. So to me, this builds on what we tried to do, 50 years ago or more, and takes us to a new place where we can try something better that has been already proven in other parts of the world. So anyway, I thank Will for bringing this to everyone's attention. He's really done a great job getting the ideas out, so much so that Janice Lewis George picked up on it and other council members. I think the bill is co-sponsored, I believe, by 6 council members. So it's pretty well positioned to pass, but it would be lovely if everyone understood about it and was supportive. So thanks to everyone for attending.
And
Okay, go ahead.
if I could just piggyback to Robin's point, it's a much more efficient way to build housing than we do right now in Washington, D.C. Just explain the wharf, which the way we do it, we give a bunch of public resources to developers to build luxury apartments. We bank on corporate largesse trickling down and somehow providing the affordable units needed. And we see that's been a total disaster. So social housing is a much more efficient way to build housing. But as far as it really not being a fantasy, in Montgomery County, the Housing Opportunities Commission of Montgomery County just built 236 units of municipally owned housing. And they're able to do it. It's sort of complicated, but they're able to do it with a $3.4 million annual commitment from the county over a 20-year period, which they're then able to take that $3.4 million annual commitment into the municipal bond market and leverage that money. I believe it's 25-1. So they're able to get a $50 million housing production fund, a revolving fund, out of that initial investment. Now, in Washington, D.C., we just passed a budget with a $450 million investment in the Housing Production Trust Fund. So we can let that money go into the private sector that hasn't worked, or we can use that to leverage a bunch of highly efficient mixed income housing, like I said, that pays for itself. But it is literally happening in Montgomery County, and we can just take their model. I mean, we can learn from their model, take their model and use, the vast wealth of the district to build in broader affordability and to build more units.
Okay. Debbie, did you have a question?
Yeah. Will, do you have any bit? Well, I think a lot depends on who is picked to be the person that's named and that's talked about in the bill to lead this. Do you have anybody in mind? Would you be interested? Do you have somebody that you know of who might be good and interested in such a position, so that it is in safe, good hands that actually support it? It won't be sabotaged by putting somebody in the position who doesn't really support it.
That's a great question. And I think it's so important to build political will from the ground up and educate community members about this. Because I think that the way it will be successfully implemented is if people know about it, it's on people's radars, and they hold whatever administration is in office accountable to put somebody in that office that knows how to do housing production and that really believes in this model. I don't want to put out any names because, I just don't want to do that. But the thing about social housing, if it is passed, if it would be enacted, it would be, the district would set itself up to be the most progressive place that's able to put in the most money to actually model how to solve the affordable housing crisis in the United States. And I would think that the district, to do that, if they bought into it, would attract the best and the brightest and get people into that office that believe in the model and that will work their tails off to make sure it's implemented correctly. But I don't think that happens without political will. I think that without political will, if people really don't know what this is, then there could be an Office of Social Housing created. And like you said, social housing becomes defined as many different types of things. So it's a great question. I don't have any names to put out there, but political will, I think, is key.
Let me suggest that it's not a foregone conclusion. The bill has to pass. And the hearing for the Green New Deal, which includes social housing, will be November 17. So we want to sign up for that. And you're going to tell us that on Wednesday there is a workshop?
There's a workshop on Wednesday at the Cleveland Park Library. at 6 o'clock. And people are welcome to come. There'll be a presentation that's really well done, really well put together, briefly describing what social housing is, and then we'll talk about testimony. And, you know, just tips on giving testimony in front of council. Maybe a lot of people that are part of this group have done that before, so you're pros and you don't necessarily need that. But if you do want to just discuss some tips and talk about testifying, we'll talk about that too.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's such a nice crowd we've got tonight. I want to introduce Robin Diener to talk a little bit about the Wardman Hotel and the strategy team that's been working for a couple of years, and they've made a lot of progress. And their expectation was to make the Wardman Hotel city property and to install social housing. There's wonderful conceptual drawings that allow for, well, let me introduce Robin and she can tell us a little bit about the Wardman project and social housing.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, hi, everyone again. I think probably most people know the Wardman, which is a former, well, we're talking about the building that is a former Marriott Wardman. It was built, I believe, in the 80s. And it's a hotel. So it's got tons of rooms already fully outfitted with plumbing, unlike the office buildings downtown, for instance, that there's a lot of talk about transitioning over from office buildings to housing because of the demand and the changes, which were, I think, accelerated by COVID in people's work habits and people doing much more working from home. And so as a result, office buildings are not quite as much in demand as they were. But the Wardman was looked at by a wonderful team of people led by Meg McGuire. Now, a lot of you might know her from WIN and other work that she's done across the city, including helping keep some of those electronic billboards off of our public streets. Anyway, she and an architect and some others worked on how we could transform this gigantic building, which was bankrupt and went to bankruptcy auction, into 500 units of deeply affordable housing, or affordable on the order of social housing, which isn't properly described. I didn't say that correctly, but what Will has explained to you, which is across affordability levels. This was all done. The Ward 3 Democrats voted to ask the mayor to purchase it at auction. It would have been, I think it's sold for $152 million. So with the news that I didn't realize that Will said we had $480 million in the Housing Production Trust Fund, we could have easily afforded it and then gotten built these 500 units of, and you should go on their website. It's Northwest Opportunity CDC, NWOP CDC dot something org probably. And they have gorgeous plans of how different size units for different numbers of family size. And it's just extraordinary. And interesting because I learned lots of things reading it. It's just a 19-page thing with illustration on every page. Because of the way the building is built with different arms, it could be phased in. So we could get the housing for some people at least sooner. We wouldn't have to wait for the entire thing to be redone. But anyway, currently, because the city did not opt to buy it, it was sold to a developer who was going to tear the whole thing down, which is, to begin with, just ecological disaster. If you know the site there, kind of up on a ridge overlooking Rock Creek Park, it's absolutely extraordinary. And it's already got, I think, 2 levels of parking underground there, and it has a huge conference center, so it's got all of this infrastructure already that could be utilized. And tearing it down, what sense does that make in this day and age with all the waste of embedded carbon and so forth? So we've asked, we continue to ask for the council to take it up, perhaps in the form of eminent domain. The money exists, we feel, in our coffers, but it'd take a certain amount of vision to want to purchase the land. We can do that, even though a developer bought it. We still have time to do that and get 500 units of social housing at this extraordinary site located over a metro, as you know, and with potential space for a grocery store, which the neighborhood has asked for repeatedly. We're not getting any elements of mixed use into the new design, 900 units that the developer has put forward, with only 72 of them at all affordable under inclusionary zoning, which, if you know that, it requires just, I think, 8-point-something% of a building over 10 units or more, which in this case comes out to something like 78 units. But they're not even at the lowest level of affordability. So they're, going to be constructed for people at 80% of AMI or perhaps 60%. And that's twice as much as I make in my life, in my annual salary at this point in my career. So I think we'd love to see social housing, both for the obvious benefits that have been talked about here of what social housing is, how we can afford it, how it returns money to the coffers, how it pays for itself, and how we could avoid the ecological impacts, which are severe. We have also asked the city for a process called large tract review, which this clearly qualifies for. It's over 11 acres, and large tract review comes online when it's 3 acres or more. But somehow the Office of Planning has determined or decided that the footprint of the building to be built is all that they need to concern themselves with. Apparently in architecture and construction, that's not typically what they do, but they consider an area of disturbance. And given that the building is 4.75 acres, the footprint of the existing building that's going to be torn down is 4.75 acres. That's already way over. So, I mean, that's probably more information than anybody wants. I'm sorry, if you want more information about that, contact me. But we're really hoping that eminent domain will be taken up by the council in the coming weeks. So if you hear about it, I hope you'll let your council members know that you support it. Thanks.
So the Wardman Hotel is still a live issue. We still are trying to get attention there for social housing. And our third guest tonight, Margaret Dwyer, represents a lot of activity up in Ward 3 as the Ward 3 Housing Justice Organization. And they're very active. Margaret, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Oh, there you are. Suddenly you appear like magic. Is one of the options that you're considering social housing, is this useful to you tonight?
Yes, well, we are an affiliate of Empower DC, and as such, we support this legislation and will be joining in the push. And I think that that's really important, that folks from all across the city speak as one about the need to have a variety of tools to respond to the housing crisis in the district. So for those of you who are on the call who might not know about Ward 3 Housing Justice, we're a group of advocates for affordable housing and economic opportunity across Ward 3 and across the whole city. And we're, as I said, an affiliate of Empower DC and a partner of the Northwest Opportunity Partners CDC that Robin just mentioned, and the Wardman Hotel Strategy Team, and the Jackson Reed Community Coalition for Change. So we've been working for 2 years. We worked on the comp plan. We've worked on the redevelopment of the Wardman Hotel. We're currently really pushing on broadening the toolbox for affordable housing and for envisioning what we want the district to look like. A couple of things we're really emphasizing We're organizing for big picture planning and Friendship Heights, not this, each parcel of land being snatched up by a different developer, but a big picture plan with the goal of creating beautiful communities with significant affordable housing in the many likely developments there, such as the Lord and Taylor site. And we recently had a good result in one area about the Lord and Taylor site. We're pretty gratified with that. We're also pushing for an acquisition fund to enable mission-driven development teams to quickly purchase commercial properties for the purpose of creating significant amounts of affordable housing, especially in areas of the city like Ward 3 with high land costs and low public land availability. So obviously, we think that social housing is another one of those ways of approaching housing that we can't afford to let go. I mean, at least we should be making a good faith effort in pushing this model to launch and to see if we can reap some of those benefits and become, Vienna on the Potomac.
Oh, there you go. Well, how many here, and we have quite a few people, are interested in giving testimony in November?
We will.
We will, okay. And DuPont East Civic Action Association will be with you. And we're going to send some people to the workshop training on Wednesday, and you should all pay attention to that. So are there questions? This is the time to ask. I'm so pleased to see the attendance tonight, if it helps you. This program should be available on YouTube after the program is over. It is on our channel, DuPont East Civic Action Association. Look for it and you'll find it and some other programs. All right. Thanks. Thank you to our guests, Will Merrifield, Robin Diener, and Margaret Dwyer. And thank our sponsors. And thank you all, our neighbors and all those who took part in the program tonight. Remember that community engagement and civic action are strength in the community. Did you want to say something, Debbie?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I'm about to sign off. What do you want to say?
No, wait a second. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I think something we need to talk about is the very fine effect that social housing has on rents across the city, that it actually competes and causes rents to be lowered, that it's a new construction project that doesn't raise rents. It actually has the effect of being a competitive, lower priced piece of good housing. That is what everyone's looking for. So even if you don't give a damn about, public housing or poor people who need housing, you should know that this will help the whole city, including middle and upper middle class renters, get a handle on their ever escalating rents.
Well, thank you, Debbie. I certainly appreciate that. I think we're going to draw the podcast to a close, and after that, the meeting will continue. So let me go ahead and do that. We hope you enjoyed the program tonight and that you will listen again for Can We Talk? Thank you.